I had just gotten married in September of that year. Just prior to this, my wife and I had moved into our first house. It was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, full of smiling faces and bright dispositions. But in this house, from the very first day, something was just off. Eventually, my wife would acknowledge this, but I knew it from the very first night. It was a 2-story home built sometime in the 1940s. It had a rustic, antique appeal. The floors were wooden, it creaked and cracked, pipes expanded and constricted. It smelled of some old schoolhouse in colonial Gettysburg, which people would take guided tours of. I once visited Abraham Lincoln's bedroom in Washington, D.C. when I was 12 years old, the one he died in, with his blood-stained bedsheets. The smell transported me back to this hidden memory immediately. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, one on each end of the hallway, with a bathroom in the middle. The room to the right of the top of the stairs became the bedroom, and to the left, a storage and makeup room for my wife. The house was full of exposed pipes and drains. This seemingly unfashionable attribute only added to its aging charm. The first night, my wife went to bed while I stayed up watching the horror film Lovely Molly. I'm sure this only magnified the feeling of general unease I was experiencing, or at least made me more aware of it. That first night, I heard a bang on the door leading to the basement, which was in the corner of the kitchen. That basement was not a place to be alone. Just standing atop the stairs, looking down into that black, murky abyss, shook both of us and infused us with overwhelming dread. She would never go down there alone, not even in the first week, before all of it started. Something was wrong with that basement. I initially dismissed the sound as a cliche of the house settling. The creaking became more apparent a few weeks in. By now it was October. It was strange. The lights in the house, when turned on, emitted a dimmer luminescence than previously. At first I attached it to that somber feeling in mid-autumn, where sunlight dwindles and dims and darkness falls earlier and earlier. One night, I was sitting downstairs watching TV, very late, past midnight. My wife was already in bed. My attention was meandering between TV and my phone when I heard a noise. The sound of pacing back and forth in the room above the couch I was sitting on, which is my wife's makeup room. The thumps were light and brisk, definitely a more feminine step, or possibly the steps of a child. I was wondering why my wife was pacing back and forth in the other room after she'd gone to bed. It didn't make sense for her to be rummaging around through boxes in the middle of the night. Those steps, they were incessant, just relentless, really. Thump, 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 thump. What is she doing? I thought. I went upstairs. When I opened the bedroom door, I saw her wrapped in the covers, snoring. I told her about this nocturnal activity in the makeup room, and she just rolled her eyes and said I was imagining things, and to lay off the horror movies. Perhaps she was right. Or so I thought. That is until she heard it herself. I was just finishing my shift at work. It was about 9:45. I closed at 10 o'clock. I was about to close the store when my phone began vibrating in my pocket, and it was my wife, and she sounded frantic, but at the same time subdued, you know? Like she was deliberately trying to be quiet. More appropriately, she sounded concerned, in a panic tone, and she says to me, "There's someone upstairs. I can hear them walking around, and I'm so scared. Please get home quick." I hurried out early. I didn't even know if I locked the door on the way out. I was home in under 10 minutes. And when I walked in the house, she was standing in the middle of the kitchen with clenched fists under her chin. all of the lights on, and her eyes were wide and she was petrified. Before I could speak, she interjected with, "Shh, listen," in a whispery tone. We stood silent and still, and then I heard it. That pit-patting of footsteps pacing nervously around the room, going in circles, walking the perimeter of the room instead of back and forth, over and over. My gun was upstairs in the bedroom. I know I frightened her when I pulled out the biggest kitchen knife I could find and started up the stairs. She had her phone open, ready to dial 911, and I looked up the imposing staircase into that darkness with dread mounting and intensifying from one second to the next. I felt my forehead break into a sweat. I didn't fool around, though. I quickly made my way up the steps, listening closely, and then right before I hit the top, the thumps halted. Well, this unnerved me to no end. I could almost hear the silence. All inanimate objects in the house lost whatever glimmer of life they had, almost as if the walls themselves were listening with me, like my house was alive and afraid for both of us. I pressed forward around the corner and flicked on the light. As quickly as I turned that light on, in a split second, the bulb flashed and then burned out. That simmering noise echoing from the electrical failure. I was standing in the doorway of a pitch-black room, and I shined my phone flashlight around the room, searched every corner. Nothing. Nobody. But she believed me. Now. A week later, we had a group of her friends over for her friend Natalie's birthday. We watched Insidious and then sat around in the dark, telling ghost stories. This is when my wife brought up our little haunting. We spoke about it with levity. That is, until a standing framed picture of us was slapped over, face down onto our glass end table. A table which none of us were near. Everyone jumped and collectively screamed, and then stopped. Silence. This only happened after a good hour, when I started talking about our ghost. The air was tense and thick enough to be physically cut, and then a gaggle of nervous, drunken laughter. There is no embellishment in describing the picture as being slapped down angrily. Not but a few days later, my wife told me something which seamlessly illustrates the overall aura and feel of living in this house. She said, "When I'm not here, I feel happy, and when I walk in this house, I feel instantly depressed." I agreed. They say evil feeds off of negativity. Throughout October and November, my wife and I had begun to argue a lot more, much of the time about benign things like leaving a dirty dish in the sink or maybe a simple disagreement about our plans for Thanksgiving. But the arguments about such mundane things had become punctuated by momentary mutual hatred, which we could not explain. When we would leave the house together, though, in the car, we would make up and ponder why such meaningless quibbles could ever fill either one of us with such anger and cruel contempt for one another. We agreed wholeheartedly that it was the house. Something didn't want us there. By November, things took a drastic turn for the worse. One night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, and my heart began to race. It felt like it was pounding out of my chest, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The left side of my face went numb, and I felt this shooting pain in my left arm, classic symptoms of an oncoming stroke or heart attack. But I was only 28 at the time. I mean, what the hell? So I jumped out of bed and I sped to the store and picked up some baby aspirin, fearing the worst. Over the next 2 months, I would have went to the emergency room 11 times and to 5 different cardiologists. Several of those times my resting heart rate was above 130 beats per minute, more than twice what it should have been. I was informed nothing was wrong with me time and time again, and that they were simply panic attacks, which often mimic strokes. This only ever happened while in this house, and by about the 5th time I ran out to go to the ER, my wife was a broken mess of tears. A horror movie junkie. One night I was watching The Exorcist 3. In the film, there's this terrifying scene where a serial killer screams the words, "He watches while I rip and cut and mutilate the innocent," over and again and on and on. I paused it right after this on-scene exchange between a murderer and a detective, and went downstairs into the basement to get laundry. That feeling that something was watching me from the shadowy corners of the room was always occurring down there, and I intentionally ignored it. I felt its anger this night. The feeling was beyond palpable. I could feel the eyes burning a hole in my back, radiating through my bones. I'm getting chills as I tell these words. At the moment, I'm extremely uncomfortable. But I digress. The feeling of hate was stabbing me like searing needles all over. It was never this bad. It was the first and only time which I smelled something. It was the smell of rotten eggs, and it wafted through the air, momentarily pungent, followed by absence. Jesus. However, something else happened that night. Something which from that point on forced me to abandon any notion of entering this basement at night ever again. I stopped at one point, and I could hear a faint voice coming from a side room. It's this strange little walled-off space in the basement which had no apparent purpose, and we used it for storage. And I heard a voice emanating from a corner of the room, and what I heard was exactly this. "I rip and cut and mutilate the innocent over and again." I paused dead in my tracks as sweat was forming on my brow and my hands were white, and I may have been shaking. It sounded like an old turned down television not more than 5 feet from me. Those words, those exact words in that exact voice from the movie. And yet, there was no TV down there. This couldn't be. I gathered a bundle of clothes and turned and ran for it with my head down, praying I wouldn't see whatever was in the corner, causing that smell. I dropped socks and underwear on the way up, but left them behind. I made it to the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut. I didn't even reach to turn off the light. I ran to the TV and assuming it had turned back on its own, but no. The movie was paused in the exact same place which I left it. Those awful words were spoken to me in that basement straight out of a horror movie. Like some loathing entity was using some copy of that scene to heed a warning to me. By now, a ghost would have been a delight. This was beyond a haunting. We were being terrorized. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was going mad. I never use drugs and I don't drink, ever. This, in turn, could not be blamed on my subconscious or my sanity. I was of perfectly sound mind, and so was my wife. So when I told this story to my wife the next day, she stopped me before I could finish. She couldn't listen to the rest of it, and I was perplexed. She mentioned that smell. She told me that earlier that day a plate which we had on our wall had been thrown to the floor when she was in the kitchen, and she said it smelled like farts. She said she blamed our new puppy, Henry, for it, and I've never seen a look of such abject horror in her eyes. It got to a level of such intense fear for her that she refused to be in that house alone after sundown. She began spending copious amounts of time at her mom's, and I understood. By now, winter had come. That year was a bad one where we lived, uncommonly fierce. which forced us into that place for days at a time. The foreboding angst of that damp, concrete basement continued to grumble beneath our feet. But now, if I had to go down there, it was always during the day, as long as the door was left open and my wife was in the kitchen talking down to me. The pipes were banging more loudly. There was an inexplicable knocking on the walls that began to catch us off guard. And those footsteps. One night, while my wife was sound asleep, I was doing my usual late-night TV. I was watching with our new puppy. He was a black teacup Pomeranian named Henry. It was past midnight. Like clockwork, the walking around upstairs began again. It persisted. I muted the TV and listened. What frayed my nerves even more was the sight of the puppy. His ears were raised, seeing all of his hair stand up as his body froze in a state of alertness. We could both hear it. The footsteps were loud now. Henry began to groan. You know that thing dogs do right before they're about to start barking. And then those horrible, brisk footsteps made their way out of the room and into the hallway. It didn't creak, crack, or grumble. It wasn't sluggish. It was moving quick and angry. And then as clear as day, it happened. Henry stood to his feet and pointed his nose towards the stairs. He moved ahead of me on the couch in a protective posture. Those footsteps began walking down the stairs. I grabbed Henry before whomever that was could greet me at the bottom of the stairs, and I bolted past the steps, and again, I was trying to not look up. I barreled through the dining room and the kitchen, swung open the back door, and pushed my way outside into the snow and freezing wind. I stood there in the most utterly horrific moment of my entire life, gripping my little puppy tight and staring into the house, standing in socks in the wet snow. I thought I saw a shadow pass through the kitchen towards the basement door and disappear. Minutes passed before even considering going back in there, but then I thought of my wife, and I got angry, and I got confident. I went back into the kitchen and opened the basement door and yelled down, "Fuck you!" I didn't know what else to do, and that was not a very smart idea. But it was a momentous occasion where my senses shot through the roof, and I felt I was ready to just jump out of my own skin and run away for good. This thing was here with us, becoming ever more enraged. Throughout the rest of the year, we witnessed that plate fly off the wall 2 more times before taking it down for good. On another night, a hanging plant over our dining room table began swinging violently with no source of wind, an event which her mother actually witnessed herself when they were cooking dinner together. Voices, knocking on the walls. One incident where the blatant knocking startled my wife to the point where she nearly spilled a pan of hot grease on herself. And a terrifying experience where I was literally sitting on the toilet and heard 3 distinct, loud, and very obvious knocks on the bathroom door. They were so apparent that I yelled to my wife, "I'll be out in a minute." And when I went to the hallway, she wasn't there, and I went into the room and found her sound asleep. The knocks, they always came in 3s. I've heard that this is some demonic manifestation insulting the Holy Trinity. I always thought that was bullshit. Well, not anymore. We toughed it out all the way to the end. We did everything we could to be positive. We watched funny movies, we laughed, and we spent as much time away from there as possible. And yes, we took Henry with us. We couldn't leave him in there alone with that thing. We did everything together and didn't linger around alone. I started laying with her and Henry while she'd fall asleep. As spring rolled around, the activity coupled with our change in attitude and working together seemed to curtail the activity. As soon as our lease renewal came up, we moved out. Gone from our lives was the darkness, anger, negativity, and being terrorized by some insidious, unseen inhabitant. But this wasn't the end of it. Sometime the next summer, I took a drive down our old street at around dusk. I pulled up to the front of the yard of the old house, and I immediately felt that old feeling of depression and anxiety. There was a for sale sign in the yard. The house was vacant. No cars in either driveway. I sat there, just stared, pondering what could have been in there with us. It looked dead, a lifeless relic of evil. As I sat there in my car, parked on the side of the street, directly across from the front door, I saw movement in my right peripheral vision. Those laced, white-veiled curtains still hung in the windows. I turned to look at the bay window where I saw something. The curtain had been pulled aside, and I saw a face. I know, that sounds crazy, but it's all true. And I hate that it's true, because it fills me with the possibility that demons might exist. But that face, pale white, so pale and sickly, lifeless black eyes, almost like sewn-on buttons with large eyelids. Its expression was that of pure derision, a warning. The eerie face was expressing a scowl, an angry scowl. How could it have known I was outside in a car on a busy street where cars always pass by? This disturbed me even more, in that there exists the profound possibility that it can see inside my mind. Something completely beyond the realm of human explanation. Oddly, it looked as if it had white hair, fashioned in exactly the same way the wigs were worn in the 18th century. Think of those old paintings of George Washington. It leered at me, and I met its stare. We probably spent a full minute penetrating each other's gaze before I decided to pull away and leave. A squatter? Possible, but unlikely. I've never seen a human who looked like that. That was in there the entire time with us. I drove aimlessly, trying to compute what I'd just seen. But I just let it go. I never told my wife. As a matter of fact, we lived in such hell that she made sure we never talked about it again. It was an absolute nightmare. Later on, we found out through a family friend that families would frequent that house in short bursts before moving out. My wife told me that she saw our old neighbor from across the street at the store. They exchanged niceties in the parking lot before my wife brought up that house. The woman whose name now eludes me told her that nobody lives there anymore. She said, "That place is absolutely haunted."